Breaking the cycle to step forward. Authentic conversations from lived experience and a professional perspective in overcoming abuse with Chris and Beverley Ann.
Hi everyone, Chris here, Breaking the Cycle to Step Forward podcast with the lovely
Beverley Ann. Hello.
Hope you're all well. Now we are really truly honoured to have John in our podcast this week again for part 2. We hope you have had a watch and or a listen to part 1, and we are looking forward to exploring John's life a bit more and finding out all about the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse.
And then, as you know, we published our final report in October 2022, on the day that Liz Truss resigned as Prime Minister. So we did have quite a wonderful array of press opportunities lined up to publicise that, but unfortunately that was a really big news story and we weren't able to take advantage of that. But the press were very good and there were lots of follow-up articles about it, but there is no doubt that not being able to do it on the day live robbed some of the impact of the report. And you know, I'll regret that forever and a day, but really that's not something you can ever foresee, that a Prime Minister is going to resign on the very morning you publish your report.
It was out of your hands, but a lot of victims and survivors, John, as you know, did really feel robbed of their voice when that happened. Yeah,
I understand that. There was no indication given to us by anybody that was going to happen.
No.
Now that's not to say, like other members of the public, we all knew that there were questions about leadership at that time, but to pull something that takes 3 months to organise, if we'd pulled it and then nothing had happened, there would have been lots of disappointed people the other way.
Yeah.
So it's another thing forever be a regret for me, because Chris is quite right. You know, it was the final report. It robbed people of that really big push to get the final report into the public consciousness. However, you know, I do think there's things we've done subsequently and continue to do that get to the really important point of this, which is to get government focusing on it and doing it, which is, you know, what we all wanted from that press at the end of the day, which I'll come to talk about in a moment.
Yeah, just pause there just for a moment. Bev, what do you want to ask?
I just want to go back just a little bit, John, because I was one of those people on that particular day as well. I was massively disappointed. But just going back, I was a participant through the Truth Project. Now, for any of the listeners listening, where does the Truth Project come into the IICSA report?
So I'll talk a bit about the Truth Project, then talk about how it comes into the report. So one of the things that became obvious to me from the very early engagement with victims and survivors in 2014-15 was that we needed a proper way to put victims and survivors at the heart of the inquiry in a number of different ways. Now, the Victims and Survivors Consultative Panel was one way, which is to have victims and survivors actually formally in the inquiry with a role helping the chair and the panel. But you also needed a way for what I think is probably the majority of victims and survivors who wanted to come and talk about their experience, did not want to do that in any sort of public arena, didn't want to be publicly identified in some way. They just wanted to come along and talk about what happened to them. And of course, that can't be evidence, because evidence has to be heard under oath. Otherwise, it's not evidence, it's information, and you can't rely on it when you're quoting it as a fact. So that's essentially how the Truth Project was born. How do we do that? So the Truth Project was essentially at its heart a system where victims and survivors could come in and talk about their experience in a way that they controlled it. We didn't ask questions. We just had people that were prepared to listen. Victims and survivors could say as much or as little as they wanted. There was all the support you would expect around that. I won't go into the details around that, but it was a way for us to hear from what turned out at the end to be well over 6,000 victims and survivors. Now, whilst that wasn't evidence, I'll try and demonstrate it like this. If you have had a formal hearing into a particular institution and you've taken evidence under oath, and let's say that institution has 500 different examples of itself around the country, I'll just say schools, for example, and you heard evidence from victim survivors that had attended 10 of those schools at random, because we couldn't do all 200, we've been here forever. And if then there was a chance that institution would say, oh yes, we agree that it was bad in those 10, but actually they were outliers, the rest of it was all brilliant. What we could do is say, well, we've heard from another 400 victim survivors through the Truth Project spread across all of your institutions, and that's not what we're hearing. So it was very valuable to the inquiry in that sense. And so we thought it was important, while we couldn't present what happened through the Truth Project as evidence, that at the end, we had a report that brought together all of the themes and things that we'd learned through the Truth Project with some anonymized quotes, so that the voice of victim survivors actually became part of that final report. So the final report was essentially in two halves, what I'd call the victim survivor's voice, and then the more formal, here's what we learned, here's the evidence, here's the recommendations. Now, neither of those things had ever been done before. These were genuine firsts for a UK inquiry. And, again, I have to pay, because I just think it's right to say these things when I think it's right. Government were very good. They were all supported by professionally trained staff to make sure that, we had the right staff on place. We actually took victim survivors' advice on how to decorate the rooms to be non-threatening and all of the sorts of things. They were, it was an expensive project to run, and these things should never be about money, but there was never a quibble from government on running that, and it had never been done before. And so I do think that, for me, I think when you get to the end of an inquiry and you look at the different people that will take things away from it, obviously government and ex-policy wonks like myself will be interested in what the evidence said and what the recommendations are. But if you look at victim and survivors, of course they want us to stop it happening to children in future, but that does nothing for them because their experience has already happened. So for me, I think for victims and survivors, from the feedback I've had, the most important thing for them was the Truth Project, because it gave something to them as victims and survivors, not just we'll stop it happening again, but actually you can be involved in this through the Truth Project. If you want to be publicly involved, you can come and give evidence. And then, so I just think that was a really important way to engage victims and survivors. What we did in the approach to the people that would facilitate those sessions from within IICSA, we just decided it would be people with a background that would mean that they could receive training that would make them suitable to be there. So ex-social workers, judges, and we asked staff in IICSA if they wanted to train, and lots of staff did, and I trained myself and took sessions myself. It isn't until you hear the complete unvarnished truth in that sort of environment that you really realise the impact. I think we all know in our heads what sexual abuse involves in all its horrible forms, but the impact of that abuse on victims and survivors is something that I just really had no idea about. We have to be honest about that. I had no idea about it, and I think that's probably true for most of the facilitators.
Yeah.
And it's only when you hear the unvarnished truth of somebody saying it in that way. It's not a courtroom. They don't have to watch their P's and Q's. Many victim survivors just said it, and then talked about how that affected the rest of their lives. It was incredible. And I always give one example here, and I'd just like to give that example again. One of the sessions I did, I'm going to have to give scant details so that we don't identify the person.
Absolutely.
But it was an 82-year-old man who had been abused by his local priest up to the age of 12. He had been lucky in that, given that we were going back to the 40s and 50s when he was a child, He had been lucky that his parents had believed him straight off and had reported it to the police. But we all know in that era, it wasn't taken seriously. The priest denied it, continued to serve in the function as a priest. This man that come to see us had taken me through the impact on his life. He said he'd got married very young at just over 18. He told his wife before they got married about his abuse because he wanted her to know about it. They'd had 2 children, and when his children had reached 18, he told his 2 children about the abuse. And he now had grandchildren. The point of him, he said, I wanted to tell you all this because from the ages of 12 to the age of 82, when I came to see you, I had never left the house unaccompanied. I'd either been accompanied by my parents, by my wife, by my children, or latterly by my grandchildren, who are now adults in their own right. And he told me that during the session we had. A couple of weeks later, I got a letter from him saying, I just thought I'd write to you and let you know that I found that such a cathartic process that today I left my house for the first time unaccompanied in 70 years. So that, I think, demonstrates just what the impact was and how the simple act of somebody just listening to you and believing you can start for some people to unburden what has been a lifetime of carrying this on your shoulder, if I can put it like that. So for me, that was quite a dramatic outcome, but many people wrote and said, I feel like I've left, a package behind, or words to that effect. So for me personally, as much as I enjoy the fact that we published a report at the end and reports as we've gone through, in a way that was not new to me. That's what people in government do in one shape or other. For me, the thing that I will always take away from IICSA is the Truth Project and the things I learned through the Truth Project, and the way that you talk to people and the way that you engage with people can have a huge impact on the way that people feel about both themselves and what happened to them, and that you can make a great difference to people if you do that. So for me, if anybody ever says to me, what's the one takeaway you have from IICSA, I always go back to the Truth Project.
Oh, thank you. I don't know about you, Chris, but I'm emotional.
We can carry on talking and literally for hours, John, but we do have to wrap up soon, and we've not got to where we want to be.
Okay.
But before we moved on, I just wanted to recognise not only the Truth Project participants, victims, survivors, but also the core participants. Can you quickly explain what a core participant is, please?
Yeah. So I mentioned that victims and survivors were welcome to come and give evidence in a formal process in the open hearings where you have to give evidence under oath. And the people that did that are called core participants, in that they are a core part of the inquiry because they're giving evidence under oath. And many victims and survivors did come and give evidence in that way. And so that is what a core participant is. And a core participant is a formal status under the Inquiries Act. It means you can get financial help from the inquiry to help with legal advice and other support that you need, travel down to go to those evidence sessions. So it's just the term in the Act that essentially is somebody that is participating in that formal evidence giving part of the inquiry. So there were other people in that. There were people from the institutions themselves, but core participants also included, in many cases, victims, survivors themselves.
And did it include whistleblowers, John?
Yes. So anybody can be a core participant. They just have to prove their significant interest in the subject matter you're looking at. And so in our case, that wasn't just child sexual abuse, because we split it up by institutions. It was child sexual abuse in an institution similar to the one that we were talking about at the time, school, church, whatever it is. And so that's the test. Do you have a significant interest?
Now, our terms of reference was individuals abused within institutions, sexually abused, but also those let down by institutions. Can we just sort of cover that quickly as a point? Yeah,
so our terms of reference were actually institutional failure to protect.
Failure, yeah.
So institutional failure to protect could be that you were in an institution and the staff failed to protect you, but it could also be if your abuse was familial, for instance, and it had been reported to the police or social services, who then didn't respond and replied properly, that's an institutional failure, because it's a failure of the institution concerned to properly protect after it had been reported. So it wasn't only institutional in the bricks and mortar sense, it was where there'd been an institutional failure to protect that had to be accompanied, if it was outside a bricks and mortar institution, by a report that wasn't acted on. Does that give you enough detail?
100%. Yeah,
so
I think so. Yeah. There are many people saying, why wasn't victim survivors abused within the family environment included in our inquiry? And my understanding was because there was an ongoing inquiry at the time into that fact. So therefore, our terms of reference couldn't include that because money was already being spent and it was already being investigated.
Yes, but what we did have, because that the reference for the other inquiry did not include people that had been let down by an institution for abuse that was familial.
Yeah,
and
100%.
And that's where I'm one of those people, and I don't mind sharing. My abuse didn't happen in the institution. I was care leaver, so I was looked after child, and the abuse happened when going home to the family. But, so that's where it encompasses.
And there were many people who came through the Truth Project that were in that situation as well. So it was quite important that a terms of reference allowed us to do that.
Now, John, what was the outcome of IICSA and how is it meant to improve child protection?
So as you know, there were the interim reports, and each of those were about a different type of institution, schools, churches. Most, not all, but most of the recommendations from those have been implemented and were designed to fix problems within that particular type of institution. And so, you know, local authorities were required to do things as a result of the Nottingham investigation. I won't go into them all because I know we're running out of time, but they've started to do those. The final report was always designed to say, this is not about any one institution, is what are the recommendations that we think as a global picture now need to happen at a national level to do two things: to make institutions better protected and better accountable for protection in a sort of operational way, but perhaps, I dare say more importantly, how do we change culture in British society to make this two things? One is unacceptable, but also more acceptable to talk about. In the inquiries, Chris will know, you talk about this as last great taboo. People do not like talking about child sexual abuse. People go, now we've been through this with rape and domestic violence, and nobody pretend they're in a good place, but people do talk about those subject matters. We are not in that place with child sexual abuse. So some of our recommendations were designed to try and get that cultural change happening. So in particular, the Child Protection Agency was, the thought process of the panel behind that was, if you have one institution nationally that is, or in England and Wales, because ours was an England and Wales inquiry, as you know, that is responsible for the guidance, regulations, etc., around the protection of children, then you get the things I talked about when I went into the Home Office: the consistency, the strategic picture. You get a much better chance that it's going to start directing institutions, issuing guidance that changes that culture within institutions. And so, as an example, you know, the CPA, the children's minister, was another example of that. Let's have one person in government who is responsible for all aspects of child protection. Let's just have that. We know the government's response to that is, we've got several. Yes, you have, but they have so many other things in their portfolios that it's not a criticism of those ministers, but they do not focus solely on child protection because they also do a whole host of other things. And so, you know, those were things that were designed to change culture. Now, people might say, well, how is that going to change culture? If you're a minister whose sole responsibility is the protection of children, that's what you're judged on. So you're going to make sure you do that job well.
Yeah.
Part of that process, you are by default going to change culture because you're going to force things through that false culture to change.
That's your one and only narrative, isn't it, John? So of course it's going to be effective because, as you said, that is your job.
Indeed. So the final report recommendations cannot be cherry picked. They were never designed. If you do this one, they were designed as a package. If you do all these things, you do the two major headline things I've described, you start to improve and fix the processes and other things within organizations, but you also start to shift the culture. Now, Chris will know this because I said it quite openly in the inquiry. It was never going to happen overnight. Changing culture, long-term aim. But you've got to put the catalyst in place that start that process happening. And that's what the final report was designed to do. Let's put those catalysts in place so that in 5 years' time, we've got a shift. In 10 years' time, that shift is bigger. You know, we've got to be honest. Those are the sorts of timescales we're talking about. But if you do that, you never have to keep coming back in 10 years' time, have another inquiry, because you know the CPA's job would have been to make sure that everything that was banked stayed banked and we didn't start going backwards. We kept. Chris will know, let's take 2 steps forward, and then if it takes a year to make 2 more steps forward, let's make sure that in total that's 4.
That's 4 steps,
2 steps forward and 2 steps back, then 2 steps forward again. So
now, John, keeping you on, why have the government not just implemented the final recommendations? Can you explain about the Inquiries Act and what needs to happen?
Yeah, so Chris will know this, one of the fault lines in the Inquiries Act is that once an inquiry winds up, there is no ability, there is no organisation that is left to hold the government to account for implementing the recommendations. There just isn't. It doesn't just apply to IICSA, it applies to all inquiries. So the Inquiries Act is all centred around setting up the inquiry, what the inquiry does while it's investigating, and sets out the sorts of things that need to go in its final report. But then it closes. I mean, it actually says, 90 days after you publish your final report, you cease to exist. And so that's why, I and others think, perhaps it's time we thought about a national body that is responsible for helping government to understand and implement recommendations and inquiries. There are many reasons, but look, a significant number of the recommendations we made would require primary legislation. I'll just explain what primary legislation means for people. So primary legislation is when you are either significantly changing an existing law or an existing piece of policy, or you're creating new. So in the case of the Child Protection Agency, it doesn't exist. So you have to get a bill going through Parliament that Parliament agrees you should create it. And then when the bill's passed, you've now got the legal framework in which to create that organisation. That's called primary legislation. And it means that it has to go through the whole parliamentary process. So if you ever watch the Parliament channel, I'm not suggesting anybody should, but if you do,
I have occasionally.
It has to be debated in the House of Commons. It then goes to the House of Lords who make amendments. It then goes back to the House of Commons, and all that goes on. That's called primary legislation. It's where it's new or significantly changes existing legislation, and it has to, in a democracy, it's quite right, that has to be discussed through Parliament. It is a truism that there has to be a general election by January next year. And because of the length of time that primary legislation takes, that we're out of parliamentary time within the timescales of the current government for that to happen. So that's not a political statement. Whatever the next government looks like, it's going to be in place in a year. And the current parliamentary timetable already has legislation stacked up within it that other people have thought was important and is important for things that have happened in the last few years. So people may not like to hear that, but there just isn't time to get that primary legislation.
This is realistic, yeah.
So that was always going to be, I think, a role for the next government. However, what I will say is what would have been nice, wouldn't it, is if the current government have said, we agree with this, it is a good idea, and we will, we want to do it, and, we'll commit to do it after the election if we form the next government. That would have been a place to be. But that isn't what happened. What we've got is, a commitment now that mandatory reporting will go in the Criminal Justice Act, which is great. We've had some consultations on some of the other recommendations, and, I'll keep the views on consultation to myself, but other than
for now,
we just have 8 years of actual evidence taking, why do we need more consultation? But consultation isn't implementation.
No.
Can I just be clear and make a personal statement?
Yeah.
The purpose of any inquiry is to make sure it hears all the available evidence that it can about whatever it's investigating, to consider that evidence and what it tells you, and to recommend to government what you need to do to stop that. And we spent 8 years doing that. We heard from hundreds of witnesses that gave us that. We received millions of pages of evidence. What more does a government need to implement it? And what more important thing could there be in our society in protecting our children? And so, you know, I think government should just get on and implement it. Now, you know, I was with Chris at an event in Parliament the other week where we give that message out. I give that message out whenever I do talk about this. I know Alexis Jay, who was chair, you know, has written to government about this and has met with ministers about this. But all of those things are influencing, because that's all that I individually and Alexis and others can do now is influence, because there is no formal process where we're now an exit inquiry, we have any authority. We don't. We're just talking as individuals. So I would like to see either this government or the next government thinking about whether that's the right way to implement inquiry recommendations. I recommend there'd always be competing space for what is in any parliament, a restricted amount of time to get primary legislation through. But I think, you know, a body that has a degree of independence that advises government on which ones are important to do from which inquiries and giving a rationale for that. You'd always have disappointment that your one wasn't one that got in the first stage, but at least you've got somebody looking at it and saying, we think this is why it's important you do this one from this inquiry and this one from this inquiry, and you can have that debate, and then everybody understands why their one didn't get in the first tranche and which tranche it will be in, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
But where we are right now is that we continue to influence, but we have a commitment to put mandatory reporting in the Criminal Justice Act, which I think is good. It was one of our major recommendations. It is one of those that will change culture, but it was part of a package, and it will be hugely helpful. But on its own, it does not have the impact that a carefully collated series of recommendations in the final report was intended to have, to do those two things, which is change culture and improve practice, so that all children are much better protected in future, and we can start to really nail this really dreadful epidemic of child sexual abuse we're all seeing. And, you know, the last thing I'll say is we're now seeing it increasingly online, and we're seeing all sorts of, like, avatars coming up. This is only going to get worse, and we really need to start tackling the root causes now, because otherwise we will be having another inquiry about this in 20 or 30 years' time.
Yeah, and we don't need to, as when we see the impact. What anyone listening, because obviously as a child minister, this isn't about, we want it to be cross-party. We're not in, no disrespect to what parties in government, this isn't about politics, this is about protection. So anyone listening, if they wanted to become involved and follow up and, like, how can this keep momentum going, what would you recommend to anyone listening, John?
So, look, government's no different to any other institution. The more noise you get from your customers, the more notice you take of it. So write to your local MP. Yeah. Tell them that you think it's an outrage that these recommendations haven't been taken forward and implemented. The more people that do that, the more pressure you are putting on government to move you up that list. This is not that ministers won't think it's important to protect children. They are juggling genuinely all of the competing things that everybody is telling them needs to be done. So you need to move it up that list. So write to your MP, keep writing to your MP, you know, as individuals, but where you can join as groups, and, you know, pressure in groups. People might say, we've tried this, it doesn't work. It does work, but it isn't a case of writing one letter. This is now a process where we just have to keep giving the message until the message brings us up to that point where we can all see it's received and happening. I know that's frustrating, but it really does work. Please don't lose heart and give up. You just have to keep doing it. That's the best advice I can give, because that is what works.
Thank you.
So we've got IICSA Changemakers, we've got Act on IICSA, and we are putting that template letter together, John, as we speak, to give out to anyone that wants to get involved, and then they can tweak it or write their own and send it to their MP, because as you said, to keep the momentum and the pressure up and on, we have to make noise, and we need to keep making that noise.
Yeah.
So John, last thoughts, because we are really overrunning.
So my last thought is I'm going to embarrass my host now. You know, get involved in the groups that Chris has just mentioned. Download those forms and send them into your MP tomorrow. Do not wait. You know, all the work's been done. The templates are there, but this will only happen if we all take responsibility for making it happen. So let's just do that. Let's just all make it happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, John. Last thoughts for you, Chris?
I can speak to John forever and a day on this, because there's so much we've not touched upon. But I just thank you from the bottom of my heart, John, for all the work you've done, and everything that you've shared with us today. And I'm sure that we'll be doing more interviews with you in the coming years, even down your allotment, maybe one day.
Maybe just allowed 2 next time. I do like to talk, as you know, Chris.
Yeah, but we like to talk, and we didn't get a word in edgeways, did we, Bev?
That's the quietest I think we've been in any episode. And I am going to say this. You know, it has been emotive listening to you. Thank you so much, John, for making it very clear the processes and outlining that, because we don't have any idea. You know, I am a person that took part in the Truth Project, and that was through Chris. And, you know, it is huge to be able to really acknowledge as well that when you're watching people listening to you, you see, you know, it's just something, you see the impact it's having, and you realize, wow, this is not normal. Yeah. And for some people, not for everyone, but for some people, I know I was one of them, it went on to making statements to the police. So, you know, thank you so much. But we still, you know, acknowledging all those other people that wanted to share but were unable to for lots of different reasons. So I hope this has given more insight to anybody. And if anyone's listening and have got any questions, please contact us on breakingthecycle2stepforward@gmail.com. If you're watching this on video, you're watching it on YouTube, make a comment and we'll come back to you. Or if you're listening to us on an audio format, you'll be able to contact us through there. So please, if you've got any questions, just ask us. So that's our thank you. John, you get the final say-so before we go. Last thoughts.
I just say, you know, it's great for me. For me, despite everything else, this is another opportunity for me to say, you know, what IICSA did, but perhaps more importantly, what we can all do together to now that final push to getting those recommendations in place, because otherwise it's all been in vain. So, you know, if
please don't say that.
No, it won't be in vain. We'll keep the momentum going.
Just get those letters into your MPs, join those local groups, you know, really keep the pressure up. It can be soul destroying when it, you know, a year after IICSA more than it isn't going. But if we keep that pressure up, we'll be sitting here in 2 years with recommendations being implemented, and that's the important thing. Chris will know this. I never give up. So just take a leaf out of my book, please, and don't give up.
We'll be more like John. That's what we're going to do. More like John.
In some respects.
You won't get me down an allotment digging up vegetables. Sorry, that's not my bag.
Yeah. And, you know, I dress like it's the 1950s. Don't do that either.
Nothing wrong with that. I'll come down to the allotment and drink tea and watch what you're doing.
Yeah, we can watch and advise, can't we, Bev? That's always a... Anyway, John, it's been a pleasure having you on.
Okay.
Yeah,
fantastic.
100%. And I'm just going to stop recording right now.
Okay.